The chandeliers of the Matador ballroom did not cast light. They dripped it, thick and syrupy, like frozen tears of liquid gold. It pooled on the polished marble floors, slid over the silks and velvets of the city's elite, and caught in the facets of diamonds that adorned throats and wrists. The air was heavy, a suffocating weight of jasmine and old money, layered over the murmur of conversations that rustled like silk, sliding over secrets. This was the annual Vanguard Foundation Gala, the apex of New York's philanthropic season, and, for Dr. Eris Thorne, it was the gallows. She stood near a marble column, a ghost in a simple, severe black gown that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. It had been 3 years since the scandal. 3 years since her name, once a rising star in the world of bioethics, had become a byword for reckless ambition and catastrophic failure. Tonight was her first public reemergence, a calculated test of the waters. And the waters, she knew, were filled with sharks. Her composure was a fortress built of glass. It looked solid, but she knew how easily it could shatter. She held a flute of champagne she hadn't touched, the condensation cold against her fingers. Her gaze was fixed, not on the glittering crowd, but on the man at the center of it all, Julian Vance. He was magnetic, with his silver-streaked hair, a smile that could disarm nations, and a suit tailored with the precision of a surgical instrument. He commanded the room without raising his voice. He was the founder of Vance Innovations, a tech behemoth that promised to solve the world's problems, from climate change to congenital disease. He was also her former mentor, her former collaborator, and the architect of her ruin. He saw her, across the cavernous room. His eyes met hers. There was no flicker of surprise, no malice, just a calm, predatory acknowledgement. He had been waiting for her. The knowledge settled not with fear, but with a cold, resonant certainty in the pit of her stomach. The overture was over. The performance was about to begin. Later, Julian took the stage to a symphony of applause. He was being honored for his foundation's latest initiative, a $1 billion pledge to fund STEM education in underserved communities. He spoke with his signature blend of humility and visionary zeal, his voice a perfectly modulated instrument that played on the audience's aspirations and their guilt. He spoke of progress, of the future, of the moral duty of the successful to lift up others. And then, he turned the knife. Innovation is a journey fraught with peril, he said, his gaze sweeping the room before landing, deliberately, on Ares. It demands passion, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the greater good. But passion, untempered by pragmatism, can lead us down dangerous paths. A hush fell. Everyone in that room knew the story, or rather, the story Julian had so masterfully crafted. They knew of the incident at the Northwood Institute, the promising research project that had ended in tragedy and public disgrace. They knew Eris Thorne was the one who had been in charge. Julian's voice softened, filled with a counterfeit sorrow. We all mourn what was lost at Northwood. It was a profound tragedy, but some of us have managed to build something positive from the ashes. He smiled, a beatific mask of magnanimity. It's a lesson in resilience. A lesson, I hope, we all can learn from. It is wonderful, in that spirit, to see Dr. Thorne with us tonight, a testament to that very resilience. The humiliation was exquisite in its cruelty. He had not attacked her. He had pitied her. He hadn't condemned her. He had used her as a cautionary tale, a prop for his own virtue. He had taken their shared, shattered past and recast it as her personal failing and his noble recovery. The murmurs started, A low tide of whispers and sidelong glances. The weight of their judgment was a physical pressure, pressing in on her from all sides. But Eris did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply lifted her chin, a fraction of an inch, and held his gaze. Her expression was one of serene, almost clinical observation. In her mind, she was not a victim in a ballroom. She was a scientist observing a specimen. She was running a diagnostic on Julian Vance's hubris, calculating the precise architecture of his lies. He expected her to crumble, to flee. He had built his narrative on the foundation of her weakness. He had no idea that for the past 3 years, she had been meticulously, patiently, building a weapon on that same foundation. Her lack of reaction unsettled him. She saw it in the barest tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. The polite applause for his speech felt, for a moment, hollow. He had landed his blow, but the target had not recoiled. For the first time, a flicker of something other than contempt entered his eyes. Uncertainty. Eris allowed herself a small, cryptic smile, a gesture meant only for him. It was a promise. She lowered her gaze, picked a single, perfect raspberry from a passing tray, and placed it on her tongue. The sharp, sweet burst of flavor was the first real thing she had felt all night. It tasted like the beginning. Eris's apartment was the antithesis of the Midair ballroom. It was a small, Spartan space in a nondescript building on the far west side. A place of exile. The air here smelled not of jasmine, but of old paper, ozone from her overworked servers, and the faint, bitter scent of cold coffee. There was one window, which looked out onto a brick wall. It was a monk's cell, dedicated to a singular, unholy faith, the deconstruction of Julian Vance. The walls were not decorated with art, but with a sprawling, intricate web of information, corporate flowcharts, financial statements, personnel lists, and satellite maps of Vance Innovations facilities were interconnected with colored yarn, creating a complex tapestry of power and influence. It was the work of a person obsessed, but it was not the chaos of madness. It was the meticulous, ordered work of a brilliant research scientist who had simply changed her field of study from cellular biology to the pathology of a single man's empire. For 3 years, this had been her life. Days were spent in the digital archives of the SEC, in the dark corners of the web, in ghostwriting academic papers for a pittance to pay the rent. Nights were spent here, in this room, piecing together the empire Julian had built on the wreckage of her life. She slept little, and, when she did, the sleep was haunted. The nightmare was always the same. The sterile, white corridors of the Northwood Institute, the low, insistent hum of the climate control systems, the scent of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and sharp. And then, Lena Vance, with her laughter like wind chimes and her fierce, brilliant eyes, so much like her brother's, but without the coldness. Lena, her best friend, turning to her just before entering the containment lab. "Are you sure about this?" Eris. The pressure readings are on the edge of the tolerance band. And Eris, confident, driven, checking the data one last time. The simulations are stable. It's within parameters. We proceed. That decision, that single moment of professional certainty, played over and over in her mind, a perpetual echo in the silent chambers of her guilt. The memory always ended with the shriek of an alarm and a flash of blinding white light. She would wake up with her heart hammering against her ribs, the scent of smoke and metal filling her phantom senses. Her only link to her old life was Dr. Ben Carter. He had been a junior researcher at Northwood, a quiet, unassuming man with a fierce loyalty and an unshakable belief in her integrity. He was now a tenured professor at Columbia, one of the few who had refused to sever ties with her after the scandal. He visited once a month, bringing groceries, academic journals, and a connection to a world she no longer inhabited. "You're going to burn yourself out, Aris," he said during his last visit, his gaze sweeping over the yarn-covered walls. "This isn't research. This is a vendetta." "A vendetta is just research with a definitive conclusion," she had replied, not looking up from a complex schematic of Advanced Innovations data center. "Julian is one of the most powerful men in the world. What can you possibly hope to achieve from a 2-bedroom walk-up with a standard internet connection?" "You're thinking like an engineer, Ben. You see resources and logistics," she said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes, usually so distant and analytical, held a flicker of intense fire. "I'm thinking like a biologist. Every complex organism, no matter how powerful, has a single point of failure, a fatal flaw in its genetic code. I'm just looking for his." Ben sighed, placing a container of soup on her cluttered coffee table. "I brought you the latest quarterly report for Syntech, the subsidiary you were asking about. And I looked into their acquisition history like you asked. Nothing unusual. They bought a small, defunct sensor manufacturer from Ohio about 5 years ago, a company called Helios Controls. It was a patent acquisition. Looks routine." Eris's fingers stilled over her keyboard. "Helios Controls," she repeated, the name unfamiliar, yet strangely resonant. "Send me everything you have on them." He did, and for 2 weeks, Aris followed the digital ghost of a company that had ceased to exist. It was a dead end. Until tonight. After returning from the gala, the calculated cruelty of Julian's words echoing in her mind, she sat before her monitors, a cold fury settling deep in her bones. She pulled up the Helios Controls file again, cross-referencing its old employee manifests with current Advanced Innovations personnel. Nothing. She searched patent archives, SEC filings, news reports. Nothing. It was a clean, unremarkable corporate absorption. Frustrated, she leaned back, the image of Julian on the stage, basking in the glow of his false nobility, burning behind her eyes. Some of us have managed to build something positive from the ashes. The ashes of Northwood. The ashes of Lena. On impulse, she reran her search. But this time she cross-referenced the Helios Controls acquisition, not with Advanced Innovations' corporate structure, but with the archived equipment manifests from the Northwood Institute. For hours, the algorithm churned through terabytes of data. Aris waited, the silence of the room broken only by the hum of the servers. At 3:17 a.m., a single line of text flashed on her screen. Match found Helios Controls, Model 7 Environmental Sensor Array, Unit Serial, YARJ HC78814. Location, Northwood Institute. Containment Lab, 3. The lab where Lena had died. A chill, colder than any nightmare, washed over her. It was a connection, a faint, gossamer thread in the vast, dark web she was weaving. It meant nothing. It could be a coincidence. But in Aris's world, there were no coincidences. There was only data, and the patterns it revealed. Her phone buzzed, vibrating against the scarred wood of her desk. An encrypted, anonymous number. She answered, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Yes." "Is this Dr. Thorne?" The voice on the other end was distorted, cautious. "The one from Northwood." "Who is this?" "That doesn't matter. I worked in risk management at Advanced Innovations for 10 years. I was let go last week. They're cleaning house before the annual shareholder meeting, getting rid of anyone who knows where the bodies are buried." There was a pause. "I know what Julian Vance did to you. He used the same playbook on me. He finds a scapegoat, builds a narrative, and buries the truth under a mountain of money and NDAs. Eris's knuckles were white where she gripped the phone. What truth? I can't say over the phone, but I left something for you. A digital dead drop. The access key is Lena. He talks about her sometimes. In the late-night meetings. Says he promised he'd build a world she'd be proud of. The voice was thick with contempt. He built it. All right. Just not the way he claims. The line went dead. Eris's hands trembled as she typed the access key into the secure terminal. LINA. A file decrypted. It was a single, heavily redacted internal audit report from Vance Innovations, dated 6 months after the Northwood incident. The subject was the corporate acquisition of a small company, Helios Controls. Most of the document was blacked out, but one paragraph remained, a single island of text in an ocean of redaction. Post-acquisition forensics on Helios Controls' flagship product line, the Model 7 sensor array, revealed a critical flaw in the primary pressure transducer under specific atmospheric conditions. The unit is susceptible to catastrophic failure, resulting in a complete sensor blackout. It is recommended that all existing units be recalled and decommissioned. Public disclosure of this flaw could expose the parent company to significant legacy liability, particularly in relation to the Northwood Institute incident. Aris read the paragraph once, twice, 3 times. The words seemed to lift off the screen, rearranging themselves into a new, horrific reality. The sterile white corridors of the nightmare. Lena's voice. The pressure readings are on the edge of the tolerance band. Eris's reply. The simulations are stable. It's within parameters. Her decision had been based on data. Data from a faulty sensor. The glass fortress of her composure cracked. A single, dry sob escaped her lips. A sound of agony 3 years in the making. It wasn't her fault, but that realization brought no relief, only a deeper, more profound horror. Julian had known. He had acquired the company, found the flaw, and buried it. He had let her take the fall. Let the world believe she was a reckless scientist consumed by hubris. All while knowing the truth. He had built his empire on her disgrace, on a lie that protected the true cause of his own sister's death. The grief was a physical blow. But beneath it, something else began to crystallize. The cold fury she'd felt earlier now had a target, a purpose. It was no longer just about clearing her name. It was about dismantling a monument to a lie. Her research was over. The hunt had begun. The first move had to be a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Eris needed to test Julian's defenses, to see how he would react to a threat he couldn't trace directly to her. The whistleblower's report was her weapon, but firing it directly would be suicide. Instead, she chose a subsidiary, a small biotech firm called Eterna Health, that Vance Innovations had acquired 2 years prior. Eterna was Julian's pet project, working on cutting-edge gene therapies, and its clinical trial data was, according to the whistleblower's notes, aggressively massaged. From a burner laptop in a public library, Eris crafted an anonymous tip. She didn't send it to a major news outlet, which Julian could easily suppress, but to a niche, fiercely independent regulatory blog run by a retired FDA inspector known for his dogged persistence. She packaged the information not as a smoking gun, but as a series of astute, unanswerable questions about Eterna's Phase 2 trial results, complete with just enough leaked internal data to prove her query was not idle speculation. It was the digital equivalent of a single, perfectly placed drop of poison in a well. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Eris monitored the blog, the financial news, the low-level chatter on industry forums. Silence. She began to fear Julian's information control was even more absolute than she'd imagined. Then, on a Tuesday morning, The blog post appeared. Questions mount over Eterna, health's miracle drug. It was a dry, technical piece. But it was enough. By noon, 2 major investment banks had downgraded Vance Innovation stock from buy to hold, citing potential regulatory headwinds. By the end of the day, the stock had dipped by 3%. It wasn't a catastrophe, but it was a tremor. A sign that the foundations were not as solid as they appeared. The retaliation was swift and brutal. Eris had known it was coming, but she had underestimated its precision. Julian didn't come after her directly. He came for the last vestiges of her professional life. A fellowship she held at a small, independent bioethics think tank in Boston, a position that provided a meager stipend. But, more importantly, access to academic databases was rescinded. The email from the director was apologetic, but firm. Unforeseen budgetary constraints. It read, a paper she had ghostwritten for a professor at Stanford was suddenly pulled from publication. The journal citing concerns about methodological rigor. The professor, a man who had praised her work for months, stopped returning her calls. The final blow came from Ben Carter. He called her. His voice strained. Eris, I can't help you anymore. The university's compliance office called me in this morning. They said my association with you poses a reputational risk to the institution. They mentioned the Northwood investigation. Old news they've suddenly decided to re-examine. They didn't threaten me. Not directly. They never do. But the message was clear. It's my career. Or you. I understand. Ben, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Thank you for everything you've done. She hung up and stared at the brick wall outside her window. Julian hadn't just suspected her. He had confirmed it. He hadn't used a sledgehammer. He'd used surgical lasers, excising her from the academic world with terrifying efficiency. He had severed her last lines of support, cut off her access to information, and isolated her completely. He was tightening the noose, expecting her to struggle, to make a mistake. The isolation felt like a pressure against her eardrums. For a moment, the sheer scale of his power, his ability to bend the world to his will, was overwhelming. The monk's cell of her apartment suddenly felt like a tomb. But then, the biologist in her took over. He was treating her like a threat to be contained. But in containment, cut off from the outside world. Some organisms don't die. They adapt. They evolve into something leaner, harder, more dangerous. He had taken away her tools, so she would have to find new ones. He had cut her off from her allies, so she would have to operate alone in the shadows. He thought he had her cornered. In reality, he had just set her free from the last rules she had felt compelled to follow. She turned back to her wall of yarn and data. Her world had shrunk to this single room, but her target had never been clearer. She picked up a new spool of red yarn, the color of blood, and began to weave a new thread, connecting not corporate entities, but people. Julian's inner circle, the ones who enabled him, protected him, and knew his secrets. The investigation had just entered a new, more personal phase. Operating from the shadows required a new set of skills. Eris, the academic, had to become Eris, the spy master. Her first move was to hire a private investigator, a former financial journalist named Marcus Thorne, no relation. A coincidence that felt like a grim joke. He was expensive, cynical, and utterly discreet. She met him in a dimly lit coffee shop, paying in cash and communicating through encrypted channels. "You want me to dig up dirt on Julian Vance," Marcus said, stirring his espresso without looking at her. "That's not digging for dirt. That's trying to tunnel through a mountain with a teaspoon. The man's life is a fortress of NDAs and high-priced lawyers. I'm not interested in his personal life. Eris said, her voice low. "I'm interested in his professional history. Specifically, the people he's discarded along the way, disgruntled former executives, researchers whose work he's stolen, whistleblowers he's silenced. Every empire is built on a graveyard of careers. I want a map of that graveyard." While Marcus began his work, Eris focused on a different kind of archaeology. She couldn't access institutional archives anymore, but the public domain was a vast, untapped resource. She spent weeks sifting through old local news articles from Ohio, looking for anything related to Helios controls. She found it in the archives of a small-town newspaper, a grainy photograph from a 2005 article about Helios winning a local business award. In the photo stood a proud, middle-aged engineer, the company's founder, a man named Robert Chen. Beside him stood his daughter, a young woman with a bright, intelligent smile. And next to her, looking awkward and impossibly young in an ill-fitting suit, was Julian Vance. The caption identified him as a promising young research associate from the Northwood Institute, consulting on the project. Another thread. Julian's connection to Helios wasn't a recent, post-scandal discovery. He had known them. He had worked with them years before the accident. The discovery sent her deeper. She found Robert Chen. He wasn't in Ohio anymore. After Helios Controls went bankrupt and was sold for parts to an anonymous holding company, a company she now knew was a shell for Vance Innovations, he had dropped off the map. Marcus's skills proved invaluable here. He found Chen living in a small town in rural Oregon, working as a high school physics teacher. Eris knew she couldn't approach him herself. She was a ghost. She sent Marcus. He went under the guise of a journalist writing a "Where Are They Now" piece on forgotten tech pioneers. The report Marcus sent back was heartbreaking. Chen is a broken man. Marcus wrote, he blames himself for the company's failure. He says they were on the verge of a breakthrough with their Model 7 sensor, but they had a persistent glitch, a pressure transducer flaw they couldn't solve. They were running out of money. A young consultant from a prestigious institute, a man named Julian Vance, advised them to push the product to market anyway. To secure a second round of funding, Vance helped them falsify some of the testing data, assuring them they could fix the bug with a software patch later. The product launched, failed spectacularly in early deployments, and the company went bankrupt. Vance disappeared. A few months later, the Northwood accident happened. Chen saw the news reports, saw Vance on TV, and has lived in fear and silence ever since. He's convinced Vance let his company die to bury his own involvement with the faulty tech. Eris read the report, her blood running cold. Julian hadn't just covered up the flaw. He had been complicit in its creation. He had advised a desperate man to cut corners, to falsify data, the very sins for which he had crucified Eris. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of breathtaking cynicism. Julian's entire narrative, his story of rising from the ashes of a tragedy caused by another's recklessness, was a lie from its very foundation. She kept digging. She found the redacted incident report from Northwood, the official one. It was a masterpiece of corporate misdirection, filled with technical jargon that ultimately pointed the finger at operational error and a failure to adhere to established safety protocols Eris herself had helped write. But in the appendices, buried under pages of irrelevant data, was a single, cryptic reference, a maintenance log entry from the day before the accident. Containment Lab 3 sensor array, HC78814, flagged for anomalous pressure readings. Junior researcher L. Vance requested manual recalibration. Request denied by senior staff pending further diagnostics. L. Vance. Lena. Eris stared at the line of text, her heart pounding. Lena had seen it. Lena had known something was wrong with the sensor. She had tried to raise the alarm. But who was the senior staff who had denied her request? The report didn't say. The name was redacted. But Eris knew. There were only two people with that authority in the project hierarchy. Her, and the project's co-director, Julian Vance. It couldn't have been her. She would have remembered. An urgent safety request from her best friend the day before a critical experiment. It was unthinkable that she would have denied it, or forgotten it, which left only one possibility. The full, monstrous truth finally revealed itself to her. A hideous shape emerging from the fog. This wasn't just a cover-up. It wasn't just a corporate malfeasance. Julian's entire crusade against her, the destruction of her career, the public humiliation, the years of her living in disgrace. It wasn't about protecting his company. It was about hiding his own role in his sister's death. He had been the one to deny Lena's request. He had been the one to let the experiment proceed. Knowing the sensors were faulty, perhaps hoping to secure the data he needed before anyone noticed. And, when it all went wrong, when his sister was dead, he had found the perfect scapegoat in the other person who could have given the final go-ahead, his brilliant, ambitious, and ultimately trusting partner, Eris Thorne. His vendetta wasn't revenge on her for a mistake she had made. It was a twisted, desperate act of self-preservation. He had destroyed her life to absolve himself of his own guilt, rewriting history with himself as the grieving, resilient hero, and her as the villain. The revelation hit Eris with the force of a physical impact, knocking the air from her lungs. The yarn-covered wall in her apartment no longer looked like a map of a corporate conspiracy. It looked like a memorial, a testament to a 3-year-long lie. The grief she felt was immense, a tidal wave of sorrow for Lena, for herself, for the stolen years. But as the wave receded, it left behind a shoreline of pure, cold, unadulterated rage. Her plan had just changed. This was no longer about exposing a fraud. It was about delivering a reckoning. Julian Vance was not a man who believed in coincidence. The tremor in his stock price, the sudden blacklisting of Eris Thorne, and now, a discreet inquiry from a financial journalist asking about a defunct Ohio company called Helios Controls. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was digging. Someone was meticulously pulling at the threads of a tapestry he had spent years weaving. And he knew who it was. His counteroffensive was not born of panic, but of cold, calculated fury. Eris Thorne was a loose end he had foolishly believed was tied. Now, she was proving to be a virus in his perfectly curated system. And the only way to deal with a virus was to eradicate it, and everything it had touched. His first target was Marcus Thorne. One morning, Marcus woke up to find his bank accounts frozen, a flag from the IRS for a surprise audit, and a visit from 2 stone-faced detectives from the NYPD. They had questions about a source he had used in a story 5 years ago. A source who was now, they claimed, linked to an organized crime syndicate. The charges were baseless, a phantom conjured from the ether of legal intimidation. But the message was clear: drop the investigation, or your life will be systematically dismantled. Marcus called Eris from a payphone. "They're coming after me," he said, his voice tight with a fear she had never heard before. "This is beyond corporate hardball. Eris, this is something else. Whoever you're fighting, he doesn't play by any rules." "I'm sorry, Marcus. I never should have involved you," Eris said, her own voice a low whisper. "It's not your fault. I knew the risks," he replied, "but I'm out. I have a family. I can't fight this. I've wiped all my files." He's won. Next, Julian went after Ben Carter. It was more subtle. An anonymous tip was sent to the university's tenure review board, alleging that some of Dr. Carter's early research contained plagiarized material. It was a lie, but a lie that would take months, if not years, to disprove, effectively stalling his career and casting a permanent shadow over his reputation. The final warning was delivered directly to Aris, not through a lawyer or a threatening email, but with a chilling, personal touch. A package arrived at her apartment, a small, elegant box from a high-end chocolatier. There was no note. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a single, perfect, white orchid, the same type of flower that had filled the arrangements at Lena Vance's funeral. It was a message of terrifying intimacy. It meant he knew where she was. It meant he was watching her. And it was a reminder of the secret they both now knew they shared. I know you're digging into the past. Stop, or I will bury you with it. The orchid sat on her desk, its pristine petals a stark white against the dark wood. The threat was real. Her allies were neutralized. She was alone, exposed, and in the crosshairs of a man with limitless resources and no conscience. The rational part of her brain, the scientist, screamed at her to run, to disappear, to accept the defeat he was so clearly offering her. To continue now was not just professional suicide. It was a risk to her own safety. She looked from the orchid to the wall, to the final piece of evidence she had uncovered, the maintenance log, with Lena's unheard warning. She thought of Robert Chen, the broken engineer in Oregon. She thought of Ben and Marcus, their lives upended for the crime of helping her. And she thought of Lena, her bright, laughing friend, sacrificed on the altar of her own brother's ambition and cowardice. This had become a moral equation, and the variables were no longer just about her own name or her own justice. Julian had built an empire on a foundation of lies that had crushed innocent people. To back down now would be to validate his power, to concede that truth was a commodity that could be bought and buried. To back down now would be the ultimate betrayal of Lena's memory. Aris picked up the white orchid. She didn't throw it away. She placed it in a small vase of water and set it in the center of her desk. It would be her focus, a reminder of the stakes, a reminder that some things, once broken, can never be repaired, only avenged. She turned to her computer and began to liquidate her last remaining asset, a small retirement fund from her university days. She would need the money for the final phase of her plan. She was done digging for information. It was time to build her weapon, and she knew exactly where she would deploy it. The main ballroom of the New York Hilton Midtown was a sea of dark suits and impassive faces, a cathedral consecrated to the gods of capital. The air was sterile, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, and smelled of nothing at all. On the stage, under the glare of impossibly bright lights, Julian Vance was holding court at the Vance Innovations annual shareholder meeting. The event was being live-streamed to a global audience of millions, a testament to the man and the myth he had built. He was in his element, moving across the stage with the easy grace of a rock star, painting a dazzling picture of a future powered by Vance technology. He spoke of AI-driven medical diagnostics, of carbon capture systems that would heal the planet, of a world without disease or pollution. His voice was a hypnotic symphony of hope and progress, and the numbers on the massive screen behind him projected earnings, market share, growth trajectories backed up every visionary promise. The stock ticker in the corner of the stream glowed a healthy, vibrant green. In the 10th row, seated amongst the anonymous block of retail investors, was a woman no one recognized. Her name, according to the registration, was Eleanor Finch, a retired schoolteacher from Scarsdale who had, over the past month, acquired a significant number of voting shares through a series of quiet, brilliantly executed proxy maneuvers. She wore a simple gray suit, her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was partially obscured by unassuming glasses. It was Aris Thorne, utterly transformed. She had spent every last dollar she had, Leveraging the expertise of a disgraced but brilliant hedge fund manager, Marcus had pointed her to before he disappeared. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, a single, desperate bet to buy her way into this room, to purchase a few minutes on the microphone during the shareholder Q&A session. As Julian wrapped up his presentation to a roar of applause, the moderator, a slick financial journalist, stepped to the podium. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. We will now open the floor to questions from our shareholders." Hands shot up across the room. The moderator pointed to a man in the front row, a well-known analyst from a major bank. The questions were softballs, inquiries about dividend yields and emerging markets. Julian answered them with practiced ease. Aris waited, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Her hand was not raised. She knew she would not be chosen at random. She had arranged, through her proxy, to be placed on the speaking list. Her question pre-submitted under a bland, technical heading query regarding legacy asset management and risk mitigation. "We have time for one final question," the moderator announced, from Ms. Eleanor Finch. A spotlight found her. A microphone was passed down the row. Aris took it, her hand steady. She stood, and for the first time, looked directly at the stage. Julian's eyes met hers across the distance. A flicker of recognition, then confusion, then a dawning. Chilling horror transformed his face. The charismatic smile froze, then melted away. He knew. "Mr. Vance," Aris began, her voice clear and amplified, filling the cavernous room. It was not the voice of Eleanor Finch, the meek schoolteacher. It was the voice of Dr. Aris Thorne, the scientist. "You've spoken eloquently today about the future. I'd like to ask a question about the past." A murmur went through the crowd. On stage, Julian's composure was cracking. He gestured to the moderator, a subtle, sharp motion. "I believe we are out of time. My question is for the shareholders." Aris cut him off, her voice ringing with an authority that could not be denied. She turned her body slightly, addressing the room, the cameras, the world. "I want to ask if this body is aware that the foundation of Vance Innovations' biotech division, the very technology that underpins the Eterna Health gene therapies, is built on intellectual property stolen from a failed Ohio company called Helios Controls." The room erupted in a cacophony of shouts and whispers. The stock ticker on the screen behind Julian flickered, then dipped into the red. "This is an outrageous and baseless accusation," Julian thundered from the stage, his voice losing its modulated calm. "Security, remove this woman." But Aris was not finished. "I want to ask if the shareholders are aware that Mr. Vance served as a consultant for Helios Controls years before its bankruptcy, where he advised them to falsify safety data on a faulty sensor array, the same sensor array that would later be installed at the Northwood Institute." The red on the ticker deepened. Panic was beginning to ripple through the room. Men in dark suits were speaking urgently into their phones. "Lies," Julian shouted. "She is a disgraced and delusional researcher with a personal vendetta." "Am I?" Aris's voice was now unnervingly calm, a scalpel slicing through his bluster. "Then, perhaps you can explain this." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a simple USB drive. "This drive contains the unredacted internal audit from your own company, proving you knew the Helios sensors were faulty when you acquired the company and buried the evidence. It also contains a sworn affidavit from Helios's founder, Robert Chen, detailing your role in falsifying the original safety data. And finally, it contains the Northwood maintenance log from the day before the accident, the log showing that your sister, Lena Vance, identified the sensor flaw and requested a manual recalibration." Julian went pale. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the two of them. Aris delivered the final, Devastating blow. Her voice dropped, becoming intimate, as if she were speaking only to him. Yet it was broadcast to the world. The log shows her request was denied by senior staff. We both know, Julian, that I never saw that request, which means the person who sent Lena into that lab, knowing the equipment was faulty, was you. You let your own sister die, and you built an empire on her grave, using my life as the tombstone. A collective gasp went through the room. The stock ticker was now in a freefall, a cascade of crimson. Julian stumbled back, his face a mask of utter ruin. The myth had been shattered. The man was exposed. But Eris had one final twist of the knife, one final reveal she had held in reserve. But here is the most tragic part. Julian. The part that I only uncovered last week. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. The reason you acquired Helios, the reason you buried its failure so deep, was not just to hide your involvement. It was because you were trying to protect your family's legacy. Because the company that manufactured the faulty pressure transducer inside the Helios sensor was a small electronics firm that your own father's venture capital fund had invested in 20 years ago. The corruption that killed your sister, it started with your own family. The revelation was a psychological implosion. Julian stared at her, his eyes wide with a pain that went beyond professional ruin, beyond public humiliation. It was the agony of a man forced to see the full, monstrous scope of his own self-deception. His entire life, his entire vendetta, had been a lie he told himself to avoid a truth that was far too terrible to bear. Security was moving toward her now, but it was too late. The damage was done. The truth was out. Eris looked at the broken man on the stage. She felt no triumph, no elation, only a vast, hollow emptiness. She had calibrated the precise emotional payload of each secret, and she had delivered it perfectly. But the cost was written on his face, and it was a terrible thing to behold. She dropped the microphone. It clattered on the floor, the sound echoing in the sudden, absolute silence of the room. She didn't offer him a choice. She had already made it for him. She had released everything. And now, she would let the world tear him apart. The collapse was immediate and absolute. The live stream of the shareholder meeting became the most watched viral video in history. Within hours, Vance Innovations stock was worthless, its assets frozen by federal regulators. News reports, feeding on the documents Eris had simultaneously leaked to every major media outlet, detailed a scandal of breathtaking scope, combining corporate fraud, a tragic cover-up, and a deeply personal story of betrayal. Julian Vance, the visionary billionaire, became Julian Vance, the pariah, a modern-day Greek tragedy playing out on a global stage. Eris watched the immediate aftermath from a sterile hotel room. A ghost who had finished her haunting. She saw news clips of federal agents raiding the Vance Innovations headquarters, carrying out boxes of documents. She read articles detailing the multiple investigations now underway by the SEC, the Department of Justice, the FAA. The empire had not just fallen, it had been pulverized. The next day, she met with Ben Carter and Marcus Thorne in a quiet park. The freeze on Marcus's accounts had been lifted. The investigation dropped as suddenly as it had appeared. The tenure board at Columbia had issued a formal apology to Ben, citing a grievous administrative error. They were safe now. "I watched it online," Marcus said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've covered corporate takedowns my entire career. I've never seen anything like it. You didn't just bankrupt him. You unmade him." "He unmade himself," Eris said quietly. "I just held up a mirror." Ben looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. "What now?" Eris, you've won. You've cleared your name. I'm not sure, she admitted. The singular focus that had driven her for 3 years was gone, leaving a void in its wake. The revenge was complete, but the victory felt strangely hollow. Later that week, she drove upstate to the small town where her parents lived. They had been casualties of her scandal, their quiet retirement shattered by the shame of their daughter's public disgrace. They had never fully blamed her, but a distance had grown between them, an awkward silence born of pain they didn't know how to address. She found her father in his workshop, sanding a piece of wood. He looked up when she entered, his eyes filled with 1,000 unasked questions. "The news," he began, his voice rough. "They're saying it wasn't your fault." "It wasn't," she said. He put down the sandpaper and walked toward her. He didn't say anything else. He simply wrapped his arms around her, holding her with a strength she hadn't felt since she was a child. For the first time in 3 years, Eris Thorne allowed herself to cry, not with rage or grief, but with the quiet, shattering relief of coming home. A week before his indictment, Julian Vance requested a meeting. Eris agreed, meeting him not in a boardroom or a lawyer's office, but in a neutral, public space, a small, empty gallery exhibiting black and white photography. He looked like a stranger. The charisma was gone, the tailored suit replaced by simple, ill-fitting clothes. He looked older, smaller, a man hollowed out from the inside. They stood before a photograph of a winter bear tree, its branches like dark veins against a white sky. "I used to tell myself," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "that I was building a world that Lena would have been proud of. A better world. And that the price your career, the lies, was justified by the outcome." "Was it?" Eris asked, her tone not accusatory, just curious. He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the photograph. "I wasn't building a world for her. I was building a fortress to hide in. A place where I wouldn't have to be the man who ignored his own sister's warning." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes clear of artifice for the first time she could remember. "The things I did to you. There's no excuse. But the truth you revealed, about my father, about where the flaw originated, in a strange way, it was a kind of absolution. A terrible one." He explained that he had carried the guilt of denying Lena's request for years. A secret poison. His crusade against Eris had been a way to transfer that poison, to make her the source of the tragedy. But her final revelation had shown him that the poison had been in his family's bloodline all along. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I just wanted you to know." There was no anger left in her, only a profound, shared sadness for the two brilliant young scientists they had once been, for the bright, laughing woman they had both lost, and for the wreckage their shared tragedy had wrought. "Goodbye, Julian," she said, and walked out of the gallery, leaving him alone with the ghosts in the photographs. 6 months later, Eris stood in the dilapidated main laboratory of the Northwood Institute. The facility had been abandoned since the accident, a concrete tomb sealed by tragedy and litigation. But Eris had used her restored reputation and the considerable consulting fees she was now offered by companies desperate for an ethics overhaul to purchase the land and the building. The air was thick with the dust of dormant years, and the afternoon light slanting through the grimy skylights illuminated dancing motes. The lab was a time capsule of disaster. Whiteboards were still covered in faded equations. A coffee mug sat on a console, a dark ring of residue at its bottom. This place had been the source of her greatest trauma, the setting of her recurring nightmare. But standing here now, it felt different. It felt like a beginning. She was sketching on a tablet, outlining plans not for experiments, but for classrooms, for collaborative workspaces, for a new kind of institution, a place dedicated not just to science, but to the conscience that must guide it. The sound of footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. A man in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase, walked toward her. "Dr. Thorne," he asked. "My name is David Chen. I'm an attorney." "I'm not looking for representation," Eris said, not looking up from her work. "I'm not here to offer it. I represent the estate of the late Julian Vance." Eris froze. She hadn't known. The news had reported he'd taken his own life in his cell 2 weeks after being sentenced. The lawyer placed his briefcase on a dusty lab bench and opened it. He pulled out a single, thick document. Before he died, Mr. Vance liquidated his remaining personal assets. Everything the government hadn't seized. It wasn't much compared to his former wealth, but it was still a considerable sum. He placed it all in a trust. He slid the document across the bench to her. "You are the sole beneficiary. He has given it all to you, to fund your new foundation." Eris stared at the lawyer, speechless. "There was one condition," the lawyer continued, his voice soft. "A legally binding codicil." He pointed to a specific line in the document. Eris read it. "The foundation and the rebuilt institute must be named in perpetuity the Lena Vance Center for Ethical Science." Tears welled in Eris's eyes as she looked at the document. At the final, unexpected act of a man she had destroyed. It was not forgiveness. It was not a plea for redemption. It was, in its own broken way, a confession, an apology, and a final, desperate attempt to build something positive from the ashes. It was the only way he knew to honor his sister's memory. Eris took the pen the lawyer offered. Her hand was steady as she signed the document. The ink was a dark, definitive line on the page. Her revenge was complete, but it had been transformed into something more. It was no longer an act of destruction, but of creation, a legacy of healing, built on a foundation of truth. In the name of the friend they had both lost. She had won, and in the end, so had Lena.